Good afternoon. My name is Kavira Weissman, and I'm a co-founder with Delco Coalition for Prison Reform. We want to thank everyone for being here today, especially people who are here to share their stories. Councilman Zidek, thank you for being here today. We also want to thank Councilman Madden, who has voiced support for this issue and wanted to be here, but had another commitment. We want to let you all know that we did invite multiple elected officials from both sides of the aisle, including all members of County Council and the prison board over email as well as by phone or in person, but we did not hear back from some of the other members of council. I'm here to share a little bit of an overview about our organization and the context for deprivatizing this prison. We have a PACT program. Just to tell you a little bit about DelcoCPR. We were founded last year and we're focused on local prison reform and ending mass incarceration. Our first issue campaign is deprivatizing Delco's prison. We want to see this prison return to county management and public oversight. Our leadership team includes people who are formerly incarcerated at this facility, lawyers with clients there, community leaders, and activists from across the county. We hope you will join us if you haven't already. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter, sign up for our email list, and come to our monthly organizing meetings, which are held the third Thursday of each month at 7:30. George Hill Correctional Facility is the only privately managed county prison in all of Pennsylvania. It's technically a county jail, but colloquially many people refer to it as a prison, which is what I'll do today. It has 1,883 beds. 88% of the people who are incarcerated there are detainees, which means they have not been sentenced, and more than half of those are there because they can't make bail. The population doesn't reflect the population of Delaware County. 50% of the people there are black, for instance, and there's only 21% of black people in the county. So they're incarcerated at way higher rates. There's a history of a lot of issues at this facility, including wrongful deaths, high numbers of suicides, sexual assault, and many other issues which we'll hear about today. It's privately managed by GEO Group, with a contract up for renewal in December of this year. It's changed hands a few times among a few private companies. It was with GEO Group initially, then Community Education Centers, back to GEO Group again, and some of the staff has stayed the same during those different management companies. We're going to answer questions later. Thank you. The superintendent for this facility is John Riley, who is also the Republican Party county chairman's brother. He's the brother of Andy Riley. We believe that we want to make conditions more humane for people incarcerated there, as well as for staff who work there who are often overworked. So private prisons, as you may know, are a billion-dollar growth industry. They have many areas in which studies have shown that they're worse than public facilities. They're more unsafe, and they have worse recidivism rates, for instance. They also often have something called occupancy clauses, which is where they guarantee that beds be filled. This is very important because in our county, we've been told that GEO Group, the county has to pay GEO Group $13 a head for every bed that's not filled. And this is from Superintendent John Riley during our prison visit. If, for instance, they dip below 100 people a year, 100 people daily for a year, that would amount to $474,500 annually the county would have to pay GEO Group above and beyond the contract. So there's really an incentive built into this arrangement for filling beds, not for rehabilitating people. GEO Group is the second largest private prison company in the United States. They also donate heavily to Republicans. And for instance, in 2015, they made $2,135 per prisoner nationwide. So they're really here to make a profit. They may want to look like they're doing a good job, so they continue to get contracts, but their incentive is not rehabilitation, it's making money. In terms of county council and the prison board, there's a $49 million line item in the county budget for this facility, and typically council is the body that authorizes contracts. For everything else in our county, they're the ones making the contracts. And they should have supervisory oversight of this facility. The prison board is a unit reporting to county council according to our county's administrative code. However, we don't know when the last time is that they actually reported to council. They are the ones that have authorized this contract with GEO Group. They are the ones that have signed for it. We believe they've overstepped their authority and that this responsibility really should belong to county council. The prison board is also supposed to hold public meetings, but their meetings are held inside George Hill Correctional Facility, where you can't have recording devices and where it's not very accessible to the public. So why deprivatize? We believe this is a moral issue, that no one should be profiting from the incarceration of human beings, and that private prisons are really not incentivized to rehabilitate, which leads to more recidivism. We believe it's an economic issue. Research has shown that the idea that privately managed prisons are more economically efficient is actually a myth. that they cut corners, that they report what they want to, and that they, for instance, can do things like deflect medical costs to other entities. Long-term, there are also economic costs of higher rates of recidivism for our communities and for taxpayers. We also think it's a transparency issue. We need better oversight in order to have more humane treatment. We need to be able to see things like operating budgets and how much they spend on educational programs compared to other counties. We can't access that information because it's proprietary to GEO Group. We want to know how that $49 million is being spent. So in conclusion, we're calling on Delaware County Council to stop hiding behind the prison board by requiring them to publicly report in county council meetings and to terminate the contract with GEO Group and return George Hill Correctional Facility to county management and public oversight. Thank you very much. I would like to turn it over to Heather Isabel Schumacher, our moderator for today's hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Kabira. My name is Heather Isabel Schumacher with the DelcoCPR leadership team, and I will be moderating today's public hearing. Our next speaker is Jack Stolzheimer.
Thank you, Heather. My name is Jack Stolzheimer, as you've just heard. I'm a former prosecutor, both here in the county and as a federal prosecutor as well. And I'm very proud to say that under President Obama, the Department of Justice came out and issued a report saying private prisons are wrong, they're unjust, and they needed to end. Unfortunately, after the 2016 election, we had a different president come into power, and stocks for companies like the GEO Group have dramatically increased because private prisons are back on the agenda, and we need to stop it here and stop it now in Delaware County. As Kabira said, this is a facility that is managed by the county through a contract with a provider, GEO Group, who has had this contract for over 20 years under a variety of different entities, but they claim all of them now because they have subsumed and bought those different entities. GEO Group actually had this contract in 2008 when they had to terminate the contract early, in part because of the rising costs for their bad management of the facility. They had litigation costs and unemployment costs that made it unprofitable, which is one of the other reasons why any government agency should think seriously about ever privatizing a base core government function like running a prison, because it can't be just completely at the whim of somebody who's only willing to do it and do it correctly for a profit. So let me just tell you a little bit about the process of where we are. As you heard, the entity that legally has the contract with GEO Group is called the Delaware County Board of Prison Inspectors. It's appointed by members of the majority on county council. It's a 5-member board. 3 are appointed by the majority on county council. 2 are appointed by the president judge of the county. All of those officials are Republicans. The president judge was elected as a Republican, as is the chairman of the Board of County Council. So those people have had this contract with GEO Group for 20 years. The current contract expired in 2016. At that time, they decided to give them a 2-year extension. That extension expires on December 31st of 2018. That is why this year we can terminate the contract with the GEO Group and bring this core government function back under county management. That is our goal. The Prison Board of Inspections meets, as I think Heather and Kabira have talked about, they meet periodically. They have canceled several meetings because activists from outside of the normal people who come to their meetings, as they would look at it, have been present. They are not a transparent organization. They held their meetings at the prison. They don't post anything on the web about what they decided or what their agenda is. But when we started coming to county council, Kabira, myself, Gwen McCullough, others, to raise this issue, and when Kevin and Brian raised it from their seats on county council, Chairman McBlain did 2 things, which sort of belied the fact that this is not a county council decision. He told us the county council would make the prison board do 2 things. They would put out the contract under what's called a request for proposal. This is the way government entities do public bidding. At the same time, they would do an analysis, a report showing, giving decision makers like Brian Zidek the right to see what the costs are under private management as opposed to public management. And they hired the Board of Prison Examiners in their April meeting without any public bid, hired a company called Phoenix Management to conduct that second study. So as we sit right now, there has been a request for proposal on the street. The county let that over the summer. companies have come in, they've looked at the facility, and they're preparing to make a bid to run the county correctional facility. At the same time, Phoenix management is supposedly undergoing a study to prove whether or not this is the economically better deal for the taxpayers and the prisoners in the prison. That's, of course, the wrong way to do government work, right? You don't already decide you're going to do an RFP. At the same time, you're kind of deciding whether or not you should even do an RFP. But having said that, they haven't been able to finish this report. The Phoenix study is at least a month overdue. I think some of you probably have recently seen in the local newspaper, but our great county controller questioned the legal bills. $370,000 have been spent for 3 lawyers working on that study. This does not include the actual Phoenix consulting firm themselves. But so far, we've spent $370,000 on this study, which is not timely and isn't finished. And we don't even know what the ultimate cost is going to be. So at this point, County Council is the entity that we're going to have to ask to date exactly what Kabira mentioned and are going to remain up here, I think, for everybody to see. We want to terminate this contract, no matter what the Phoenix study says. We'd like to see the Phoenix study. We'd like to see the argument as to why anybody thinks this facility should be private and not run by a public entity. But we think that the County Council majority and the Board of Prisons need to get their homework done, get their report finished, and then have a public meeting where they decide whether or not County Council, the people we elect, not a board of private prison examiners, are going to decide whether or not we privatize or continue to privatize this facility. Thank you very much, and I'll turn it back over to Heather.
Thank you, Jack. Richard Mosley will share next about the human cost of the situation.
Hello, how's everyone today? My name is Richard Mosley. I am a member of Put People First, which is a statewide organization, and we fight for human rights, particularly health care on the outside and health care within the prison system. I'm part of I'm the coordinator for the Fayette Health Justice Project within that organization, which deals with SCI Fayette, which is sitting on 50 million tons of waste, and we're seeing a high rate of cancer-type illnesses and deaths with the inmates, with the guards, and with the residents of LaBelle, PA. So that's what I do, and our organization is working with the Delco CPR. Thank you. Okay, I'll share this. First of all, I would like to thank each and every one of you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. Today, I would like to touch on a few things. The first is after all the stats and budgets are discussed, we still have something that's looming, and that's the human cost to all of this. Many returning citizens or ex-offenders, whatever you choose to label them, they come back to society and they need a lot of help. They need emotional help, they need financial help, they need psychological help. So we have to always ask ourselves, are we still in this for the punitive part, or is there actually still a rehabilitation side to all of this? Because we're dealing with men, women, and children that are attached to all these budgets, all these numbers, every dollar spent. Well over 75% of people incarcerated are coming back to society. They are coming back to our neighborhoods, coming back to our churches, they are coming back to our synagogues, our schools. They are coming back to shop at the same stores that we shop at. So I believe that we all have stock in this, because I'm sure we all want to see these men and women be productive and contribute to society. So when you talk about public safety, I believe these things make us all safer. As for me, as an ex-offender, as a business owner who hires ex-offenders, I continue to stay hopeful that we are still a people of second chances. Thank you for your time and your opportunity for me to speak to you about this matter. There's a human cost attached to all of this, so let us not forget about that. Thank you.
Next, Jennifer Murphy will discuss some of the research on private prisons.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Jennifer Murphy, and I'm going to just expand on some of the points that Kabira made in her initial presentation about research on private prisons a little bit more general. To put everything into context about what we're talking about, George Hill Correctional Facility, it's good to get a little bit of background about when and how private prisons emerged, and then look at some research into possible cost effectiveness, safety issues, and recidivism. So as far as the background and context, several states did have private facilities at various points between 1850 and 1950, but they were phased out because of inmate abuses. So what we're talking about today is a relatively new phenomenon of private prisons emerging in the 1980s and 1990s. So at the state level, the first private prison opens in Kentucky in 1986, the first federal private prison contract in the late 1990s. So currently 18 states use private prisons along with the Federal Bureau of Prisons. We can't dissociate the use of private prisons from mass incarceration. So just the rise of incarceration rates in the 1980s and 1990s set in motion a fertile ground basically for private prisons to emerge with increased incarceration and increased prison costs. Private prison companies came in to try to deal with this issue. Kabira was talking a little bit about the GEO Group. They are the second largest provider of privatized correctional and detention facilities worldwide, operating over 100 facilities in several countries. And one of the biggest growth areas for private prison companies are into other kinds of facilities. So immigrant detention facilities, drug rehabilitation programs, reentry facilities. These are areas where private prison companies are increasing their footprint. About 65% of ICE detainees today are held in private prisons. So here's a little chart to just show you over time the growth in the number of prisons in private facilities at the state and federal levels. So today we're talking about 8% of all inmates across the United States are held in private facilities. So it's a relatively small percentage of the entire prison population, but it's a growing one, and almost all new prison construction in the last 10 years has been by private facilities. So cost effectiveness research, one of the things that private companies like to talk about is that they save taxpayers money by operating prisons privately, but the research does not support this claim. There are a number of studies done, 1990s, 2000s, contemporary studies, showing that either private and public facilities are similar in costs, or that private facilities, if they do save money, tend to do it because of the cut to labor that they do. So these studies, though, at the same time are very difficult because it's hard to compare apples to apples, and facilities are very different when you look at different facilities and the populations that they manage. But at the state level, there have been several state level studies that are quite good, because Mississippi, for instance, manages both private and public facilities at the state level, so they can provide some comparisons of facilities. So all those state level studies show that there is no cost effectiveness to using private facilities run the prisons. And like I said, any cost savings that are found in some studies, which tend to be done by those private corporations themselves, have been found to be due to salary differences. On average, those working as correctional officers in private facilities make about $7,000 less per year than their public counterparts. There are also lots of safety issues, as Kabira mentioned, higher rates of serious incidents in private facilities, higher rates of assault both between people in prison and those with staff. Recidivism rates also show, some studies show no difference in recidivism rates between private and public prisons, and this is even taking into account some studies showing that private prisons keep those in prison longer on average than their public counterparts. And at least 2 statewide studies find higher recidivism in private prisons, that if someone's incarcerated in a private facility, their risk of recidivism actually increases by nearly 20%. So just in conclusion, really no solid support for claims of cost effectiveness. Private prisons have many issues with safety and security, and higher recidivism rates. And a problem with the lack of transparency is that there are still a lot of unanswered questions about what actually even happens in these private facilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Bob Ciccinelli with DelcoCPR and the PA Prison Society will share suggested improvements for George Hill.
Good afternoon. As Heather said, I'm on the board of directors of the Pennsylvania Prison Society, which has for 231 years been charged by the legislature with monitoring the conditions inside our prisons and jails. To do this, we are the state's official visitors. We have the same access to every prisoner in Pennsylvania that Governor Wolf has. I also sit on our public policy committee, which allowed me to tour dozens of state and county facilities and even some facilities in other states. Finally, I'm the convener for Delaware County, which means I coordinate all of the official visits for SCI Chester, the GEO Community Corrections Center in Chester, George W. Hill, and even our juvenile detention facility in Lima. With all of that, I'd like to ask you to visualize the difference between a prison and a correctional facility, a distinction I learned from a PhD level former administrator at SCI Camp Hill. Simply put, a prison is a warehouse, and a correctional facility is a place of self-improvement. A prison serves public safety through the limited short-term goal of incapacitation. A correctional facility has the enhancing long-term benefit of rehabilitation. Since about 97% of those we incarcerate will one day return to our community, we have to ask ourselves whether we want them in a warehouse or in a place that will really help prevent future crime. We spend a lot of money on George Hill, and yet we're not getting very much. By far, the largest number of complaints the Prison Society receives are about poor health care services. I have walked through that area of the facility. It's clean, it's bright, it's modern, and it's used about the same as the nurse's office at your local school. Indeed, the quality of medical service available there is about a step below what you get if your coverage came through Medicaid. Very few people go into George Hill in great health. They arrive with wounds, illnesses, addictions, and even pregnant. Their concerns are addressed either by a nurse on duty or by sending them out to a hospital. There's a huge gap in between, and that should alarm us. No one expects a prison to provide platinum level health care, but we can and should demand a lot more of George Hill's medical subcontractor. We shouldn't be fielding complaints about rampant flu outbreaks, poorly treated wounds, untreated pre-existing conditions, untreated dental abscesses, and perhaps most sadly, miscarriages. The second most frequent concern we hear is the almost complete lack of responsible mental health care. You will hear about a newly admitted young man who didn't receive his psych meds for more than a week. In fact, we estimate that more than 50% of those entering our criminal justice system suffer from at least one diagnosable mental illness or condition, making the system the largest provider of mental health care in Pennsylvania. Sadly, mental health care gets a small fraction of the money we pay GEO Corp to run George Hill. Our citizens who suffer from depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, and psychoses are often taken to George Hill because of their behaviors. Imagine them being subjected to prolonged isolation. Imagine them being forced to deal with their symptoms without their medications. Imagine their only contact is with a corrections officer whose concern is for their behavior and not their mental health. Is it any wonder that behaviors related to mental illness are addressed through discipline, things like solitary confinement 24/7? The third cluster of concerns center around staff attitudes. To be fair, these men and women were hired to guard prisoners, and that's not the same as the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections' mission of care, custody, and control. We find constant allegations of staff abuse towards the men and women at George Hill. The abuse is verbal, psychological, physical, and even sexual. Not all abuse is direct, some of it's indirect, meaning it comes from the forms of neglect, indifference, and apathy. Not only do many staff not care about the inmates, they don't care what their colleagues are doing to those inmates. Now, this isn't new, but George Hill enjoys an extra layer of obscurity created by the lack of direct public oversight. Instead, we're expected to rely on the contractor to self-report the abuses, to rely on the county administrators to self-admit that they can't reduce or eliminate the abuses, to rely on a prison board that doesn't even discuss the abuses during their public meetings, and to rely on a county council which has, for decades, pretended they aren't even responsible for what happens inside that prison. The fourth category of complaints comes from the families and friends who try to visit their loved ones. We hear stories about visitors denied access because of their clothing, because paperwork isn't in place, or because an inmate has just been moved to another housing unit. A significant number of visitors are sent home because they couldn't get through the metal detector or pass the drug scanner. The visitors are subject to pat-down searches of their bodies. Recently, the facility ended weekend visits altogether. Mr. Riley once told me personally he was on a mission to stop the introduction of drugs into the facility, which is a noble goal, but doing it by eliminating all contact visits if he can. It looks like he's getting there. Contact with families and friends is crucial to re-entry. The more a prisoner can receive mail, make phone calls, and sit with those who care about him or her, the better his chances of doing better on release. At George Hill, visiting is being curtailed. Prisoners don't get a few free envelopes each month, and phone calls are expensive. Even the Philadelphia prison system does better than this with 7,000 men and women in its buildings. In closing, let me borrow from my good friend Nelson Vecchione, whose comments will close today's hearing. We need dignified, humane treatment and rehabilitative services. We need transparency, and we need safety for prisoners and staff. These are not mutually exclusive. Remember those 97% of the people who go to George Hill and eventually return to our communities. The business of George Hill should be corrections and continuing to export our tax dollars to an out-of-state contractor that is not producing positive, corrective results does not ultimately benefit the community at large. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Gwen McCullough will now introduce those with personal stories at George Hill.
Hello. Hi, my name is Gwen McCullough with the DelcoCPR leadership team. Today I would like to introduce our speakers who have personal experiences at George W. Hill Correctional Facility. It is very important that we listen to the experiences of the people who were incarcerated at George Hill and their family members. You can't know what it's like until you've been behind bars at this facility. How programs look on paper is very different from what happens on the inside. Some speakers were incarcerated at George Hill very recently, and some in years past. This facility has been under private management for nearly 20 years. First with the GEO Group for a decade, then another private company, Community Education Centers, then GEO Group again. There have been issues across all of these years of private management, and many of the staff had stayed the same. Today we have a lineup of speakers that includes 4 people formerly incarcerated at George Hill, their family members, and 1 former correctional officer. We have statements from several people who shared their stories with our team who could not attend today. Their statements will be read by DelcoCPR team members with pseudonyms and with the permission of the people who shared their stories. We want to thank all of our speakers for having the courage to share their stories with us today. Your experiences are most important as we consider how to ensure a humane correctional facility that truly provides rehabilitation and treatment to the people behind its bars. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gwen. Our first speaker is Joseph Durbin.
Good afternoon. My son Jonathan has been incarcerated at George W. Hill at least 4 separate occasions beginning in 2014. As of today, he's served over 407 days. And he's been in the most recent incarceration started June 18th of this year. John's background, he gained a history of mental illness such as bipolar disorder, and he had a previous suicide attempt. He is currently housed in general population, and during his recent period of incarceration, it took John 9 weeks to get his medication. After 2 weeks of being in George Hill, John got to see a psychologist, and then an additional 7 weeks before he was seen by a psychiatrist. I visit my son weekly, and previously, when John was there, we could go 2 times a week, on Tuesdays and Saturdays. Now we're only limited to 1 day a week, Monday nights. My interaction with the guards and other staff members, that the guards are strict about observing their rules, but they're professional and respectful with us. The only other indication of other staff that I had an interaction with was John's counselor, Carol, who did call me from the outside, and I see her as doing a great job at allowing John to see his important aspects of the circumstances while at George W. Hill. My impression of the staff over at George W. Hill is they're always putting out fires. They're overworked, generally disinterested in the problems being experienced by their inmate charges. John doesn't talk a lot about, when we visit him, he doesn't talk about what goes on in there. He keeps positive. He talks about what's going on outside. He's got hope of getting out. And hope that the system's going to work for him and help him out. But when you have a disease, bipolar illness, it's hard. The worst part that John said was the filthy bathrooms and the pervasive stench of urine and other unclean conditions. He's completed certificates in 2 classes there. He's involved in the Thresholds program, which is great for him, Bible study. And he's also counseling with Carol again, and it has also enrolled in an anger management class. My opinion is that people at George W. Hill haven't done much to help John. John's done what he had to do for himself. That they're just basically caring about warehousing people and not individuals. When I asked what he does most of the day, he says he just spends most of the day hanging out, and then he goes to his scheduled classes or whatever he has to do. It's been hard on our family. My other 2 sons, it's just tough on them. They won't go see John out there, but they do like to talk to him on the phone and stuff like that. It makes it tough on all of us. When John was incarcerated the first time, he had an essay he wrote, and I'm going to apologize for language a little bit, but we're all adults here, I think. We can handle this. It reeks of piss. The hole in the ground, I wonder if I can see hell through it. Then China, then skies. I lay on a pale sky and form a bench under me. Without a box of chocolates, commence sleep. I wake up, and it still reeks of piss. Hungry, I fall asleep. I wake up, and it still reeks of piss. I get up to stretch my legs. I got caught. I'm busted. My hand was in the cookie jar and smacked red. Now herded and characterized for the rest of the farm when I wake up. My hair is a hurricane of its own nature across the land of my scalp. My eyelids sag. They gave me back my vision earlier, so I can witness the inferno I just placed myself in. Walking, it reeks of piss. I'm told I deserve to die, and I have no more power. The compass is broken, and I know I am too. My person is raised, none of my bones are broken. I tell my parents I'm sorry. My dad cries. I cry horrendously. I hate crying, I really do. It's a bad habit. So I was biting my nails, but I haven't been fed as of late. I have to digest something edible. I need to sidebar here. John's first meal at George W. Hill was a bologna sandwich with lint and staples. And he had iced tea that had phlegm spit into it. So that was his first meal, so he didn't really eat for a while. And in conclusion, I'd just like to say that I hope that we can make a change at George Hill.
Right.
Our next speaker is Suzanne Wallace.
Short, so I want it to be able to be heard.
Our daughter Janine passed away at George Hill 3 years ago due to horrific neglect and inhumane treatment. Protocols in place and protections to safeguard her were not enforced. Lack of management, supervision, accountability, as well as falsifying records and reports led to her death. Egregious violations of policy and procedure caused this tragedy. We continue to grieve her loss every single day. Janine had mental health issues. She had extreme anxiety and paranoia. She was awaiting a hearing in George Hill because of missed probation meetings. Janine was not a criminal. She had no history of violence and no substance use. She never hurt anyone. She developed a brain disease in her late 20s, not brought on by herself, no different than cancer or heart disease. Yet, she was treated as a hardened criminal in George Hill. Instead of a prompt hearing, Janine languished in George Hill for 2 months without required mental health attention. She was assessed by the facility's psychiatrist, who documented her severe mental illness and need of treatment. Upon investigation, and despite having no history of violence and no documented misbehavior at the prison, Janine was put in solitary confinement, meaning 23 hours of being isolated daily in a cell. It was discovered that Janine was denied basic necessities. Her mattress, pillow, sheets, blanket, and towel were all removed. They threw food into her cell. Janine pleaded to see doctors and cried out that she was cold. She endured this for 52 days. The final 3 days isolated for a continuous total of 72 hours because it was a holiday weekend. One can only imagine how her mind was tortured continually with such treatment. During the investigation, it was discovered that there was no documentation of why she was put in solitary and no approval of this action. If someone is placed in solitary, a review and an assessment must occur within 3 days with the warden to determine if segregation is warranted, followed by a review every 7 days thereafter. Also, daily medical visits were required. None of these requirements took place. When the warden was questioned, he responded as though he had no responsibility for what occurred at George Hill. Isn't that his job? He even admitted that he was unaware of Janine's solitary confinement. Solitary confinement is designed for someone who poses a serious threat to others or security, not for someone like Janine, who was a threat to no one. Janine was 97 pounds, 5'2". She had grab marks and bruises on her arms, legs, and back. When she was pleading for help and could no longer stand the horrific conditions and taunting, she told the guard she was going to choke herself. The guard said, "Go ahead." Janine covered the window with paper, and the guard went to breakfast. The guard did not follow suicide prevention guidelines, which demanded continuous observation of Janine. Nobody observed her after the threat, and she died by suicide. Remember, Janine had no sentence. She was awaiting a hearing for missed probation meetings. The missed probation meetings were because she had paranoia and she was running away from her supposed attackers. Guards seemed to be able to treat inmates as inhumane as they wished. with minimal oversight from all levels. Rather than observing inmates, especially those with mental health issues, the guards were found to be falsifying log records. People with mental illness, especially with no history of violence, should not be treated the same as criminals. At least 40%, and today I heard the number is even higher, of the inmates have mental illness. 10 months ago, an agreement was made with our family to include 11 new policies and revisions to the suicide prevention and restricted housing procedures. With the previous lack of oversight and accountability, we have no way of knowing if anything has changed. We appeared before County Council 2 times to plead for their interest and investigation into how George Hill actually operates day to day. They have a responsibility to Delaware County taxpayers who are paying for this horrendous $50 million contract with GEO. We never received any follow-up information from County Council. There have been at least 2 more documented suicides at George Hill since Janine's passing. There may have been more that we are not aware of. It is extremely difficult to obtain this information. We were also promised a meeting with the prison board in order to be assured that the 11 new policies were actually implemented. We are still trying to schedule such a meeting. It is up to the county to be aware and actually approve the management of George Hill and the treatment of inmates. It does not appear that this responsibility is taken seriously or again overseen. Accountability and oversight were sorely lacking 3 years ago, and since there have been more suicides, we question if anything has changed. Financial considerations of managing this facility are of concern to many. However, does anyone even know or care about the daily activities within the walls and how human lives are treated, especially the vulnerable ones? Since the prison board has not provided any verification or shown any interest in this, it is time for an outside, independent examination of what is actually taking place in this house of horrors. Our investigation uncovered gross lack of training, gross lack of supervision, and gross lack of accountability at all levels.
I'd like to invite Katie Virtue to read a written statement.
Hi, my name is Katie Virtue Guidati, and I will be sharing Vicky's story. My daughter is currently in there since July 9th, still waiting for sentencing for a DUI charge. Her PO has a detainer on her for a pending charge of DUI from medical marijuana and 2 Xanax pills from an old prescription she had 8 months ago. She had car trouble and was waiting at Royal Farms in Chichester for me, her mother, to pick her up. She dozed off while waiting, and someone called the police. The police came and they assumed she was on drugs because she was sleeping, and they charged her with DUI. The PO will not release her until she is sentenced in the DUI case. They make you plead guilty because you don't want to stay in GWH any longer than you need to. If you fight your case, you're stuck there for months. While in prison, she has been tortured. Below are the following issues that she has had to deal with so far. She was beat up by another girl and put in the hole for 6 days because she defended herself. She had a hearing before a judge in GWH, and she was found not guilty of fighting, so she was put back in the general population. During those 6 days, she had no TV, no radio, barely any food, was in the cell for 23 hours, was let out for 1 hour to shower, and had to wear a red jumpsuit. When I visited her, she had a red jumpsuit on, which is embarrassing in front of the rest of the inmates, and we could only sit in a certain section to visit because red jumpsuits are considered a high threat to others. It's a warning system to stay away from those types of inmates. They provide no pillows or a mattress that is barely there. The bunk beds are broken. An inmate on my daughter's block broke her leg trying to get out of the top bunk because the side rail was broken. When my daughter sent her clothes to laundry, most were stolen upon return, so now she washes them in the sink in the cell and tries to hang them to dry. But she gets reprimanded for hanging her clothes up on the makeshift clothesline and punished with a lock-in all day for it. There was no AC for days. It was hot and humid with no air circulation. Understaffed, most weekends guards won't show up for work, so the inmates stay locked in for most of the weekend. My daughter took a mental health test and scored way too high, so they took her off her depression medication until they received her medical records to see what type of mental health issues she has. She filed 3 grievances, but was still not seen by the doctor there or put back on the depression medication. It has now been 3 weeks. The COs are racist and dehumanize you. They treat you like an animal. I wouldn't let my dog stay there for a night. The first week she was in intake, they threatened her with a turtle suit, which is a straitjacket. They laughed at her because you go crazy when you're jammed in the cell with 10 to 12 other girls. My daughter smokes cigarettes, so I can only imagine the nicotine withdrawal that you go through. I don't understand why they don't give you nicotine patches to combat the anxiety from not being able to smoke. You have to pee in cups all together in the same room. They mixed her test up with another girl's. They started to detox my daughter from heroin, when in fact it was the other girl who was sick all over the place. My daughter said there was throw up on the floor while in intake from those that are detoxing from heroin. My daughter is 21 months clean from heroin, so she didn't need to detox with Suboxone. She insisted on taking another urine test to prove that she didn't need the detox meds. The nurse ended up being her middle school nurse at Garnet Valley, and so she helped her and had her taken off the meds. There were toilets overflowing in the cell. The same girl from before told a CO that my daughter had K2 on her, so they charged her cell, threw her to the ground, ripped out her nose ring, after they originally allowed her to keep it in because it was hard to remove. They tore her cell apart, they threw everything onto the floor. They took her down to a holding cell that had a hole in the ground, apparently for the inmates to urinate in. My daughter said it was the grossest smelling holding cell filled with flies. She had to pee in a cup again so they could see if she had K2 in her system. There was no K2, no drugs in her cell, and my daughter was put back in her own cell again. The COs finally admitted that the other girl was spreading a rumor. The other girl is now in the hole for telling the inmates and the COs that my daughter had K2. It was her way of seeking revenge on my daughter for being a good inmate who caused no problems. I called a deputy of security about a CO there that would constantly harass my daughter. I consider her a racist. She would keep threatening to throw her in the hole because she had K2 on her. But of course, the deputy of security flipped on me and told me it was all untrue. I never heard from him again because everything I was complaining about was the truth. The phone system is very poor. I can hardly hear my daughter on the phone most times she calls. They need programs to educate these girls instead of having them sleep all day, play cards, and watching TV. This is why they reoffend again and again. There is so much chaos in there because all the inmates sit around bored, some have mental issues and pick on each other. They need some type of constructed schedule during the day plus medical treatment for mental issues. My daughter said if they know you have a mental health issue, you are put on confinement in the medical unit. Last week, there was a rumor that a girl hung herself because she was depressed, apparently brain dead. I don't know how true this is and which hospital she may be at, but this is the rumor going around. My daughter knew her and was on Unit 9 with her. Of course, this is traumatizing to my daughter. The whole experience in the prison is traumatizing for her, and when she gets out, I will have to seek treatment for her for post-stress from this experience. My daughter was told by several inmates that it is much better to go upstate than to sit in that prison at George Hill. Thank you, from a mother of a female inmate at George W. Hill.
Thank you, Katie. We'd like to invite Michelle Sebastian Downey to read a written statement.
Good afternoon. My name is Michelle Downey, and I will be sharing Mary's story. Mary shared her perspective with the DelcoCPR team over the summer. Her son David and a family friend were both incarcerated at George Hill. David was incarcerated at George Hill for a period of 12 days in June of 2014. He was arrested in a parking lot outside of a restaurant and charged with underage drinking, disorderly conduct, making terroristic threats, and possession of illegal drugs. At the time of his arrest, David was under the care of a doctor for mental health issues and had loose pills of his properly prescribed medications in his pocket. As a concerned parent, Mary attempted to visit David twice during the 12-day period of his incarceration. Mary recalled being taken into a cafeteria-like area near the visiting area where she received pat-down frisks on both occasions, and both times she was denied entry. On her first appearance, they denied her entry into the facility because she was not wearing a bra. She explained to the guards that she hadn't worn a bra since the 1970s, but it didn't change the guards' decision. Clearly they could tell she was not wearing a bra. She left the facility without speaking to her son. Mary returned to George Hill a few days later wearing a bra and the exact same blouse she had worn on the previous visit. Again, she was denied entry to the facility. This time, the guards told her that her blouse was too revealing. Mary explained that it was the exact same top she had worn on her first visit, but once again, it did not change the guards' decision. This time, Mary asked to speak to a shift commander, and a higher-ranking correctional officer appeared, discussed the situation, and sided with the other guards. Once again, Mary was denied access to this facility, and she did not get to visit with her son. Mary admits to being angry after this second refusal, and she stated that the guards told her to calm down or she might be locked up too. Another guard mentioned that if she didn't calm down, her son wouldn't get the 2 rolls of quarters she brought for him. Needless to say, Mary did not want to make things worse for David, so she left, not seeing her son again. Mary indicated that many of the guards were respectful and helpful, particularly those in the parking lot area. She did make it clear that she felt that some of the auxiliary security guards standing around in the visiting room area had attitudes towards visitors and were skeptical as to whether family members or friends belonged there. Regardless, Mary indicated that visitors' movements at the facility were severely restricted. Because of Mary's awareness of her son's mental health issues and her concern for his welfare, she had extensive contact with many members of George Hill's administrative staff, including medical staff, cell block counselors, and facility administrators. For the most part, the administrative staff personnel Mary interacted with were professional and polite. At the time of his incarceration, David was prescribed Klonopin by his personal psychiatrist, but his much-needed medication was not provided once he arrived at George Hill. At the time of his arrest, Mary wanted to get David placed in the facility's psychiatric treatment cell block, but David felt safer going to the general population cell block due to concerns about the staff there. When Mary was asked about the worst part of this experience for her, she responded, "The stress and worry of trying to get him out of there." She feels David should have received treatment rather than incarceration. Mary did say that some of the staff gave David more attention because of my intervention. David's ultimate transfer to Eagleville for rehabilitation was accomplished with Mary's insistence and constant involvement. Like other former inmates we've spoken to, David suffered some negative bail issues. Mary went down to the media courthouse on a Friday and paid $2,400 to have David released. Nevertheless, David remained at George Hill until the following Monday. At first, Mary was told there are no releases from George Hill on the weekends. Later, she was informed that the authorities had discovered a previously unknown warrant. These mixed messages were confusing and frustrating. In general, Mary described David's experiences at George Hill as traumatic. She stated that, quote, David went into a semi-catatonic state upon arrival at the jail, and he hardly ate for the entire 12 days that he was there, end quote. At one point, he was doing so poorly that one of his cellies, or cellmates, called Mary to inform her of his distress. David saw fights and violence between inmates while there, but he managed to stay uninvolved in these violent episodes. To this day, he is reluctant to talk about his experiences at George Hill.
Thank you, Michelle. We'd like to invite Brother Brock to read a written statement.
Please remember, we're talking about a privatization company who's making millions and millions of dollars in profit without putting any money back into this system. As we listen to these horrific stories from these people, clearly there's an issue economically. Looks like I have two different stories to read. My name is Brother Brock. I'll be sharing Carl's story. And remember, the names have been changed. Carl shares his story at Delco team earlier this year. It's been about 11 years since Carl has been incarcerated at the George Hill facility. Today, at 41 years old, he is thriving a full-time truck driver's position. However, this story is about before those times. His earlier charges were all misdemeanors. He was sentenced for retail theft and trespassing and possession of heroin, opioid, cocaine. Carl has several DUIs, which he lost his license for years ago due to that. He was a non-violent offender. Since his last incarceration, Carl has completely rebuilt his life. He has mended ties with his 17-year-old daughter, stopped selling and using drugs, and is now gainfully employed. Yet, it took Carl 10 different stays at George Hill facility, a place that's supposed to be helping people rehabilitate themselves. Why is the conditions at George Hill so inadequate? Carl described his time at George Hill as boring, unpleasant, understaffed guards carry out their jobs milly-milly around. He said people sit in lawn chairs in the television room. Lawn chairs? They don't have enough money to buy regular facility chairs and tables? Carl considers sleeping on a hard paperless mattress as well as with no pillow, another crime. Unpleasant. It's punishment after all, he said. He felt similarly accepting the 10-minute mealtime and having only an hour after dinner to leave your cell to stretch your legs in the day room or the closed courtyard. 2 hours a day spent languishing in the cell. 22 hours a day spending time in the cell with no reading material or television to occupy your time. However, the facility does not provide adequate support for his rehabilitation. Even though Carl was able to start a GED program while incarcerated and he witnessed Alcohol Anonymous meetings occurring in the jail, there were very few opportunities to visit the library regularly, and little did they focus solely on logistical matters for his sentence. Counselors were only available for 5 or 10 minutes at a time, and they only focused on logistical matters such as sentencing. Therapists who could help prepare inmates for making a fresh start once released simply were not available. There was more than enough unoccupied time to participate in educational programs, such as life skill training and job preparation, but such programs were sorely lacking. Carl admits to pervasive feelings of helplessness, guilt, and shame that together with a lack of reform and therapeutic programs made it extremely difficult for him to see the better way of life ahead. Carl's willingness to work, learn, and change was lost.
Thank you, Brother Brock. We'd like to invite Tanita Austin to read a written statement.
I'm Tanita, and I'm on the leadership of DelcoCPR, and I will be sharing Eddie's story. Can you hear me? Eddie shared his story with our team in June of this year. His experience highlights conditions at George Hill, as well as the need for cash bail reform. Eddie spent a single episode of residency at George Hill from March to July of 2017. His charges were related to corruption of minors, CMOM, for which the judge imposed cash bail in the amount of $100,000. Eddie was unable to make bail and stayed incarcerated for 16 weeks, resulting in job loss and extended separation from family and loved ones. He was innocent of the crime for which he was charged and was ultimately acquitted. Eddie described his experience at George Hill's intake block with a mixture of anger, horror, and disgust. He was locked in a holding tank for over 5 hours, along with 6 other people. The cell was filthy and smelled terrible due to a hole in the middle of the floor that inmates were forced to urinate and defecate in. There was urine and feces on the floor, and lots of flies and gnats flying around. It was filthy and humiliating because there was no privacy. If you had to go to the bathroom in that disgusting hole, you had to do it in front of everyone else who was there. Eddie also shared, and our team has confirmed, that inmates going through intake are charged a $100 processing fee. In his case, Eddie had $103 on him at the time of his arrest, but when he initially tried to buy commissary items, he was told that didn't have enough money in his account because $100 was taken out for his processing fee. Eddie clarified that if an inmate arrives at the jail without the required $100, any money they receive on their account from family or friends will be garnished from their account until the processing fee is paid off in full. At the time of his arrest, Eddie was suffering from several medical conditions, including arthritis in his knees, requiring a knee brace and pain medication, and an eye condition requiring daily eye drops. Since medications cannot be bought in at the time of arrest, Eddie was evaluated by medical staff at intake. Eddie said staff members made several phone calls to outside physicians to verify his medical needs and assured him that he would get all his proper medical needs met. Eddie followed all procedures and submitted numerous sick call slips to go see medical staff. He said he only received his proper medications intermittently, and his medically required leg brace was taken from him at intake. Eddie indicated that his medical care at George Hill was so bad that he was forced to undergo surgery following his release. Eddie has many concerns about issues and conditions at George Hill. He confessed to feeling as though no one there cared or listened. He felt that correction staff were frequently openly hostile and confrontational, and that he and the other inmates there were disrespected and treated like animals. His primary critique of this facility was its failure to provide proper medical attention and medications to its inmate population. Eddie also described the failure of correction staff to follow institutional policies with dire consequences. He recounted episodes when heavy rains frequently caused plumbing issues that were not repaired, and there were 2 inches of water on the cell floor. Eddie also described an incident in which a guard from another cell block came to his pod, went into another inmate's cell unaccompanied, a violation of policy, and punched the inmate in the face. In general, Eddie describes George Hill as a place where, quote, no one cares or listens, where there is nothing to do, and where inmates are set up to fail, end quote. He said that with the exception of church and an offenders class, there were no educational or therapeutic programs available to him or other inmates on his cell block. Although there were 3 day room periods each day, For 1.5 hours each, there was nothing to do but watch TV and play cards or board games. Additionally, Eddie indicated that there was a law library and a gymnasium, but if the guards didn't let you out of your cell during the brief period when these activities were called, you were not allowed to attend. Eddie said that George Hill is chronically understaffed, and this lack of personnel frequently curtailed inmate visiting privileges. In addition, visitors were frequently strip searched in the restroom and at times were prevented from coming onto the facility based on prior convictions that were 45 to 50 years old. In closing, here are a few direct quotes from Eddie. Even though people are arrested, they shouldn't be treated like animals. I used to love going to the zoo, but now I'll never go again. You don't mistreat people just because you're in charge. They set you up to fail there. A nonpartisan agency should send people in there unannounced so they can see what really goes on in there.
Is Ken Prescott in attendance? No? Thank you. We'd like to invite Susan Keller to read a written statement.
Hi, I'm Susan Keller, and I will be reading a statement from Kenneth Prescott, a former correction officer at George W. Hill Correctional Facility. This is his firsthand account. The reason for this letter is based on my experiences with the company. I've experienced so many unsafe and hostile moments working in the jail. Many of my fellow officers are extremely verbally abusive toward the inmates. This creates a very hostile and dangerous environment for all the officers. I've seen the officers insult, agitate, and even take away privileges for no legitimate reason. For example, one officer verbally abused an inmate to the point the inmate wanted to fight him but couldn't because he was handcuffed. This happened right in front of a sergeant, and the officer was not stopped, verbally reprimanded, or disciplined. I've seen officers, mainly female, lock inmates in their cells because they don't like them. I've seen inmates claim to be sick and officers ignore their claims. This is every day. I've experienced an inmate in tears from pain, could barely speak, and said he hasn't eaten in 2 days. He showed me an abscess in his mouth causing his tooth to ache. I first informed the control officer on duty, and she said, "Fuck him." I then informed the sergeant when he came on the unit, and his reply was, "Fuck him." I experienced an inmate on SMU while conducting an ASA being purposefully denied food because he wasn't ready to eat when it was served. The inmate asked for his food 3 times during my tour of about 6 hours total before I notified the sergeant because the key holding officer kept saying, "Fuck him." Keep in mind this inmate is severely mentally unstable. They starved him for 6 hours. It's things like this that produce a hostile environment. It's got to stop. I've been hearing about code black incidents since my date of hire, and my observation of the inhumane behavior of my fellow officers is the main cause. This makes me weary to come to work. I feel I will be a victim because of the savage verbal, mental, and psychological abuse my fellow officers inflict on the inmates. This is not what I was trained to do during my 5 weeks of training by Lieutenant Lodehold, Captain McCarthy, and C.O. Bennett. Being weary to come to work is a feeling I never felt until my experience with George W. Hill. I understand the last officer attacked was beaten severely by a group of inmates on Unit 10. Once again, I'm sure it's based on the officer's conduct or the history of his fellow officers' abusive conduct. This was a horrible experience.
Susan. We have one final written statement from Sophia Hendler. I should say, Sophia was supposed to be in attendance today and had a family emergency, so we met, our story collection team met with her a couple weeks ago, so we're working from some notes about her experience that she had hoped to share today.
Thanks, Heather. Yes. So we don't have a fully written personal statement from Sophia, and I feel like the bullet points that she sent me and my sort of recollection, which is not the best, will not do full justice to Sophia's experience. But I do want to share a little bit of her experience. So Sophia wrote, "Hi, my name is Sophia, and I was incarcerated at George Hill from February 2nd, 2017 to March 22nd, 2017. The reason for my incarceration was a DUI. It was my first DUI, but the highest tier, and it was on January 28th. I was immediately bench warranted due to the fact that I had been on probation for several years and was on probation at the time of the DUI. Despite the fact that it was my first in a way violation, I was still put in jail until further notice. I would like to elaborate on my experience and treatment in George Hill. And one thing that stands out from my conversation with her a bit ago was that initially Sophia had been sent to Montgomery County and was there for a handful of days before she was transferred to George Hill. And in our conversation, she really stressed how different her experience was at the two settings. So a few things that Sophia mentioned. It took the corrections officers over 2 weeks to distribute my medicine, even though upon entering the prison, I was taking them daily. I spent over a week in the intake block, and that was a big difference between the two settings, where she was seen for evaluation at Montgomery County within 24 hours, and at George Hill it took days before she was even evaluated. The intake block is also known as the hole, and it's a 23-1, which is the ratio of how many hours you're in the cell and how many hours you actually get to leave to go to the block room or outside. So 23 hours in the cell and 1 hour out. I slept on the ground next to the toilet in every cell that I was in. That was 3 total, including the intake cell. The lights never fully turned out. It was almost torture. Bright neon lights constantly, and the only hope to get sleep was to put as many of your clothing or paper over your eyes as possible. I personally got written up and was threatened to be thrown in the hole for 60 days after trying to cover the light above with paper. The corrections officers provoked many fights among inmates, clearly favored some and disliked others, and actually had intimate relationships with some. And that was another piece of Sophia's experience that felt very different when talking about what was hardest for her in the two places was that she felt more unsafe with the corrections officers at George Hill than she did with the fellow inmates. That's all I have of Sophia's story, but it doesn't fully do honor to her experience, but she did want it shared.
On behalf of the story collecting team and DelcoCPR, I want to thank you sincerely to all of you who have shared stories and experiences today. We're deeply grateful for your courage and willingness to share with the public. We also hope that your stories make a difference and bring to light some of the changes that are needed at George W. Hill. Your stories are all unique, but carry some similar threads about the need for more humane treatment at this facility, including but certainly not limited to more prompt access to medical care, better mental health treatment, better access to and treatment for visitors, and improved access to educational and rehabilitative programming. We also want to see an end to mistreatment and abuse and some of the disgusting, inhumane, violent conditions that have been described at George W. Hill Correctional Facility. We call on the Delaware County Council to create a transition plan to return this prison to public management and public oversight. and discontinue GEO Group's management of this facility in the interest of truly making this prison for people, not profits. We're disappointed in the lack of response and attendance from Councilman McBlain, Councilman Culp, Councilwoman Barone, and we hope that they will join the call for deprivatizing this prison. We appreciate Councilman Madden's support for this issue, which he has voiced multiple times at council meetings. He has another commitment, as Kabir mentioned earlier, this weekend and could not attend the hearing. We're grateful for you, Councilman Zidek, for being here today. And at this time, we would like to invite you to share your comments about this facility, and we ask for your support for deprivatizing this prison and transitioning it to public management. Councilman Zidek.
Thanks. Is it okay if I sit here? Because I have lots of papers and materials that I may need to refer to, so if it's okay with you, I'll just sit here. First, I wanted to thank DelcoCPR and all of the people who participated here, either as audience members or sharing their stories. And I'd like to say that I am not a subject matter expert here. I have not personally had any family member or friends incarcerated at George Hill or otherwise. So I'm learning a lot of this as I'm going along here, and I've been learning a lot throughout the past year. I had occasion to visit the George Hill Correctional Facility maybe after I was on council for 2 or 3 months. I just took office in January, and I've got to say it was quite the eye-opening experience for me personally. It is a grim place for those who haven't been there, and the stories that I'm hearing today are not difficult to believe when you spend any time visiting the George Hill facility. So I thought I could go down 2 paths in my comments. One, I could talk about the wisdom or foolishness of private prisons, and I'll touch upon that briefly, but I'm going to go down the second path because I think that path has been fairly well covered here today. But just briefly, at my night job, I run a small business. I have about 45 employees, and the one thing that we try to do as a foundation for our company is to make sure that everybody's incentives are aligned. That as the company prospers, so too will our employees, so that we're all rowing in the same direction. And similarly, we try to make sure that our stakeholders, the vendors that we work with, the people who support us, that we all have a common incentive. And that just makes it simpler. If we all know that we're all trying to go in the same direction, we can get there more easily. And so when I look at the structure of a private prison, it seems that there's just perverse incentives. It's not in their interest. They're a publicly traded company. It is their obligation on behalf of their shareholders to make money. It doesn't make them good, doesn't make them bad. That's just part of being a publicly traded company. But our interest as a community is not for them to make money. Our interest is to make sure that we have a jail or prison that serves our county, that incarcerates people who are a danger to us, and hopefully rehabilitates those who can be rehabilitated. But it's not to keep it full. You know, I took a look at the, because I do things like this, I took a look at the annual report from GEO Group, and if you've ever read an annual report filed with the SEC, you'll note that there's a section where they talk about the risks to their business, and sometimes they may talk about geopolitical risks. If you're an oil company, you can imagine that one of the risks you might face is that there's a war. Most companies face credit or interest rate risk if they have that debt outstanding. But uniquely with the GEO Group, they talk about factors that could cause actual results to differ materially from those expressed or implied by the forward-looking statements in this report. And one of them is our ability to maintain or increase occupancy rates at our facilities. So they, which we all know, we understand that is in their. We know that to be the case, but to see it in black and white in an annual report filed with the SEC that they provide to their investors, so their investors know, hey, this is a risk to us making money. If we can't keep these jails and prisons filled, you know, we might not make as much money. So I would submit to you and to all others that when you have incentives that are as poorly aligned as these are, that you're setting yourself up for failure, that it's really impossible to overcome such a situation. I was going to touch briefly upon my own, that which I've learned about private prisons, the increase in recidivism, the increased violence in private prisons, the sort of stuff that I've learned about the telecommunications that occurs in prisons, but we've talked about a little bit of that today. So I'm going to talk about something that I think is much more interesting, which is the legal, it's actually not any more interesting, but it's something different, which is the legal framework within which our prison works here in Delaware County. So to do that, and bear with me, it's going to be a little legalese, but I think it's necessary because we have to understand the framework if we're going to understand what choices do we have to make a change. So Title 61 of the Pennsylvania Code is entitled Prisons and Parole, and it provides in Section 17 for the composition of a county jail oversight board, and I have it in front of me. So in Section 1723, it provides that there shall be a county jail oversight board that shall be made composed of the following: the county chief executive, in Delaware County that would be Mary Ann Grace, 2 judges of the Court of Common Pleas, the county sheriff, the county controller, the president of the county council, Chairman McLean, or his designee, and then 3 citizen members as provided for in subchapter C. And then there's a section of subchapter C who might be a good citizen member on this board. Section 1724 of Title 61 then talks about the powers and duties of this oversight board, and in general it is to run the prison. That's how it has the power to make all decisions with regard to the prison. 1728 of this title says that this board can't enter into contracts, though. It has to come before county council first, or the county commissioner, or as pursuant to the administrative code, which in Delaware County's case in Section 632 requires that the chairman of the county council sign the contract after county council has approved it. But Section 1723D says that counties who have our home rule charter county, like Delaware County, can opt into this section or not. And we haven't opted into this section. So it doesn't apply to us, but it easily could. If we adopted this section, we could create a new prison oversight board that would have all the people on there that I described. Importantly, 3 members of the population at large, citizens. And I think that would be useful to have more perspectives. I think, Alyssa, if I could finish here and then maybe we'll answer questions later. That's okay? So we don't have Title 61 that applies to us, but we could. So then I touched briefly on the Delaware County's Administrative Code. Delaware County's Administrative Code in Section 685 provides for a prison board. And it says that it's going to be made up of 5 prison inspectors who serve without compensation, 3 appointed by the president judge of the Court of Common Pleas, and 2 by county council. And then it provides later in that section the powers that it has. But importantly, implies, if not states, that it doesn't have the power to enter into contracts. It still has to go before county council before it enters into a contract. Section E of the Administrative Code, though, says that nothing in our Administrative Code shall affect powers that otherwise might be present in any other statute. Okay, so we have this code. Doesn't seem like we're following it. So let's see what else applies. So the last part of this journey, we've got to jump into the Wayback Machine here. And we're going to go back to look at an act that was passed in 1839. An act passed in 1839 before there was a Delaware County, before Delaware County and Chester County split. But presumably it still applies to us pursuant to the 1866 Act where the county split. And this act provides for the creation of a board of prison inspectors to manage county prisons. Article 4 says that it's supposed to direct the manner in which all bedding, clothing, provisions, and articles and supplies necessary for the support and employment of persons confined in said prison shall be purchased, and also the sale of all articles manufactured therein. Section 8 then of this act talks about the fact that the inspectors have to go to county commissioners to pay for these things. So I look at this hodgepodge of things and I've said, I don't understand for the life of me how we've gotten to where we've gotten. Who gave this board of prison inspectors the right to do what they do? And so I asked the person who I thought I should ask, which is the county solicitor. And I said to him, hey, why are we here? Why is this going on? And he said, not entirely sure, but I will look into it. And I followed up with him as recently as last week, and he said he'll have an answer to me either Monday or Tuesday. So I leave you with a a disturbing possibility that much of what has gone on should not have gone on. And by much of what has gone on, I mean the manner in which contracts are executed here. So that's something to please keep that in mind. Let's look at that going forward. So one question is, does the prison board even did they have the power to enter into this contract with the GEO Group? And do they have the power to renew it? Second question that seems to me relevant is, should the county opt in to Title 61 and create a new prison oversight board that is composed as I read earlier? And then number three, because this comes from this 1839 Act as well, it says that the prison board shall determine the quantity and kind of food that shall be kept by the treasurer of all receipts and expenditures in said prison, which accounts shall be annually examined and settled by the auditors of said county. Joanne Phillips, the controller of Delaware County, and I have had a number of conversations where she said, we have never audited the books of the prison. $50 million contract. Our the amount of revenue we raise in Delaware County through taxes and fees is $240 million a year. So more than 20% of all of the tax dollars that we get goes to GEO, and we don't audit it. And so when I asked that question on council, I was told, well, the contract with GEO gives them the right to audit themselves. And I said, well, that's a low leg asking the fox to watch the hen house. And then it was explained to me, well, hey, if we're not satisfied with the audit that the GEO Group has done, we can do our own. And I said, okay, great, well, can I see where we've done that? Yeah, we've never really done that. So that's another perspective. I know it doesn't touch upon the profound human costs that were spoken of earlier and that were spoken so eloquently of here today. But I think, in part, as a public official, one of the things I look at is that in order for us to improve upon what goes on in George Hill, we need to have a better process and a more transparent process for even running the facility. And no doubt, no matter what we do, there will be poor outcomes from time to time. But we can give ourselves the best chance possible to run George Hill in the best manner possible, I think, with a better process, a more transparent process, one that is involving of the community and one that reports back to the community. So that's what I have to say.
Thank you, Councilman Zidek. Thank you. I think that underscores why deprivatization is the first campaign of our coalition. We're grateful for your support and your commitment to transparent and accountable government. At this time, we would like to open the mic up for public comment, beginning with those who have been most affected by George W. Hill, and those who have experiences to share. So if you or someone you know has been affected by this facility and would like to speak, I'd ask you to line up over here to the left of Jack, and I'll call you over one by one. We ask that you keep your comment to 2 minutes, just so we can be respectful of our time and of other people who might have something to share. If you have a question for Councilman Zidek or someone else after that, that's fine, but we want to prioritize people who've been particularly affected. Thanks.
You are the line. Oh, looking for the line.
And any other public comments of support?
I'd like to say my name is Penny McDonald. Thank you for allowing me to have a few words. My name is Penny McDonald, and I'm the executive director over a program, an organization called Community Forgiveness and Restoration. It's a faith-based reentry program that goes into the prisons, and we work with inmates who are going to be coming home soon in the state prisons. And then when they come home, our organization provides them with resources. We have ministers, pastors, lay people, and we have life coaches that help and walk with inmates when they come home. A lot of times they come home, they don't have the wherewithal to get a job, to look for housing, and some of their support systems are totally gone. But listening to some of the issues that's going on at George's Hill, I'm appalled. And what I'd like to know, and this is my question, what can we do as a community that can attack or stop this abuse that's going on with the young people, the older people that are in the Georgia Hill. What can we do now and not wait?
Thank you. Actually, we will address that at the end. We have a list of action steps for anybody who's appalled by what they hear today and how to get involved going forward. Anyone else who wants to share to speak about this issue? If you guys want to line.
I do not have a member of the family.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, you okay? My question is to Councilman Zidek. It is my understanding that this contract was let by the chairman. Is that correct?
What do you say, let?
Awarded and signed.
I'm not sure that he actually ever signed the contract, but he may have. I've not seen it.
The contract is signed, I've seen a copy of it, the contract is signed by John Hosier from the prison board, not by John McLean.
Okay. Well, contract's a bilateral agreement, or bilateral, two people have to come to agreement.
So GEO Group would be one party and the prison board is the other party.
Oh, okay. My other question is the pre-award, the upfront work. Who can we contact to see those documents? In other words, well, not just the RFP, but that when they have to answer questions, like the qualifications for these guards and what they are, who would we contact to see them?
I would imagine the prison board. I think that's because
Okay.
I will likely ask for them.
Oh, okay.
But whether or not they give them to me.
Okay, I'm finished.
If I may, thank you so much. And if I may just add that if anyone is interested in seeing what the prison board is up to, they hold monthly meetings. It's the second Wednesday, right, Margie, of every month at 10 a.m. You do not need to have advance notice. You should drive up to George Hill Correctional Facility, say you're there for the prison board meeting, and they have to let you in. You can't bring recording devices in, but the next one is October 10th, I think, at 10 a.m. or whatever the second Wednesday is, if anyone has a calendar.
Same time as county council meetings.
Can you email it to us?
It's posted online. If you Google Delaware County Prison Board, there's a schedule which council has now added to their website. So thank you.
The recording devices include pencil and paper.
Hold on a minute. Should we have the next person?
Thanks.
I'd like to say good afternoon, and this is really, really deep. This has been happening in my community for years and years and years, and no one ever done anything about it. We've been crying in the city of Chester. Our children been getting persecuted, background, different things lodged on them that is growing and growing and growing and stopping our children from being able to get jobs and different things like that. That they don't let them have a fair hearing. You gotta take a deal. If you didn't do it, why you gotta take a deal? In order for them to get out of prison, they have to take a deal. And that if they don't give them a trial. And you know what? Let me tell you why they don't give them a trial. I need you people to hear this. The reason why they say they don't give our people a fair trial is because of the Caucasians out here in the county will not give us justice when we go to court. That if you're the jury, that you will not give us justice. So that's what we're dealing with. Everything that's been said here today is true. They're not lying, they're telling the truth. If a policeman beats you out in the street and you need to get medical help, you're not going to get it out there in that county prison no matter what. I had a nephew that died out there. they gave him an aspirin. He had a peptic ulcer, and they gave him an aspirin. So I'm just so glad that other people are seeing and experiencing what we, the people in Chester, have been experiencing all that time. Now, 50% that you're talking about, they come from the city of Chester, just for walking down the street, and I can show you the affidavit that says that. Yeah. Thank you. Hi, my name is Elizabeth Williams, and I'm the city council person in Chester, Pennsylvania, and I've been there for 8 years, and I've been going through this. Thank you.
My question is, some of the stuff described sounded like a hygiene risk or a health risk. My name's Letitia Jevons, I live in Meany, but some of the stuff described sounded like hygiene and health risks in sort of a public health issue, especially the thing with the cells and bodily fluids. And the other question is, how often do they actually clean the cells of bodily fluids? Because my mother keeps horses, and every day she or my father put them out of the stall, and they take all the waste out of the stall. So it almost sounded worse than the conditions for livestock or something where if you kept horses or dogs, you'd have PETA on your case. So has there been any audit for health and hygiene with some of these conditions? That's a very important question. I don't really know the answer. I think there should be an audit of that. It's a repeated critique that we hear. So yes, thank you. It's something we should look into. Thank you.
Hi, I just have a couple things I wanted to say. My son spent quite a lot of time in GWH, and now he's in state prison. And every visit, I would walk in and I would look at the name of that place, and I would think, obviously this place is named after George W. Hill because they are trying to honor George W. Hill. And I think, this place is awful. Who would want to be honored by a place like this? It was just the most supreme irony. And then I'd walk in, and after you got past the frisking and the body search and everything, on the wall, there's this big wall, and there's like 25 beautifully done photographs of really beautiful middle-aged people dressed beautifully, and they're all smiling, these really confident, beautiful smiles, men and women, and I'm like, who would want their face up on this place? It was just such like, and I'll tell you, the stories we've heard today, they ring exactly true with my son's experience, except I have way more hair-raising stories, which I'm not going to go into today, but it's just as it was said, and it's actually worse. That's all.
Thank you. Anyone else? Sure.
My name's Liz Goldberg, and I just wanted to add to the action plan questions. I don't know if you guys are going to get to this, or Brian, if you can comment on it, but when you were talking about the contract and Title 61 and all of these things, I was just wondering, there's obviously in part a political course of action that we need to take in terms of electing new people to county council or effectively lobbying the people we have. But I was just wondering if there was also potentially legal action that we needed to be taking as citizens if we have any legal standing to litigate.
So I haven't practiced law for 20 years, but I remember, I think the first thing they teach in law school is to say, I can't give you legal advice. Unless you're paying a lot of money, in which case they're making so I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think the first step that I'm going to take, and that we could collectively take as a community to the extent that anybody wanted to be involved, was to better understand the legal framework within which we're operating. You know, there may be, the research I did, and it came from hard work from Margie and from and Christine Ruther, who have been helping me to better understand this. There may be in, you know, 1812 Act that we didn't see, or something else. So the first thing I think we need to understand is what are the laws, and then are they being followed? If they're not being followed, then I think, you know, recourse can be had. So I guess I'd leave it there.
Thank you. Anyone else that would like to share? Or do you have
I'm just going to reiterate something that Kabira has already said, but I've been making an effort since early this year to go to these monthly meetings, and I can tell you that just showing up has changed the dynamic in the room. At the first meeting, there were maybe 2 or 3 of us, and we were completely outnumbered by prison staff, administrative staff, that the superintendent had just pulled in to occupy chairs. At the last meeting, there were more of us than them. And I just think psychologically, I mean, before we resort to the legal attacks, and all of which people are working on and thinking about, there's also a really important, there's just a lot of value in showing up and asking questions. It throws them off. They don't know what to do because they're not used to people asking questions. And I can tell you from firsthand experience asking John Riley a question, his head just about exploded out of him. He does not like to be challenged. It makes him very nervous. So I think that, and it's obviously a very inconvenient time for everybody, 10 a.m. on Wednesday morning, and you have to get there by about 9:30 because they make you wait in the parking lot, and then you have to go in and sign in. You have to give your driver's license, and they check you for everything. And meanwhile, you're not even in a secure part of the facility, but they make you go through all this folderol as if you were walking into the prison block. I mean, it's ridiculous. But anyway, so I would just encourage anyone who could possibly make a 10 o'clock meeting on a Wednesday to head out to George W. Hill, and it helps. It makes a difference.
What's the next date?
It is the second Wednesday of every month.
So October 10th, I think it is, at 10 a.m. And I just wanted to quickly add, I said a little bit of this at the beginning, but just to reiterate, Heather's going to touch on some imminent next steps you can take, but in the long run, thinking of people in Chester and other areas where people are being incarcerated unjustly and are being detained without bail and things like that, in the long run, let's keep our eye next year on the county council race. That's going to make a huge difference. Let's keep our eye on the district attorney's race. That made a huge difference in Philadelphia with Travis, and we're going to be able to vote on the new district attorney next year, and that has a huge impact. And let's keep our eye on cash bail reform, because that's a big part of what's going on there, so long term.
I just have one comment, and I'll just say it big without the microphone. I loved your announcement of the perverse incentives. And I'm wondering why we haven't been having the conversation about rewarding places that actually stabilize human beings, get them rehabilitated, like we did with the medical model. We started rewarding people for curing people, for getting them, healthy, rather than that. And so, I know this isn't specifically about this, it's a much broader, but the more I think we could start thinking about that, maybe we can sort of work more basically on prison reform overall. Thank you.
I think, just briefly, I think what GEO would say, were they here, because I've heard them say something, or people speaking on their behalf would say, is that there are elements in the contract that exist that do give them incentives to do better. My own view is that I think while there may be some incentives for them to act in a manner that we might feel appropriate, it's subservient to their larger incentives, and those larger incentives override that. The other thing I would mention is that the other races we'll have coming up next year for election too, and don't forget about 2018, is there'll be a bunch of judges for Court of Common Pleas that are coming up for election next year. And they are the folks who are sentencing people who are going to George Hill and or have the ability to make changes along with the district attorney and the entire criminal justice program here in Delaware County.
Thank you very much. We're grateful to all of you who shared your experiences and perspectives, and all of you who have taken the time out of your busy schedules, especially during this midterm cycle, to show up for this issue in person or while watching the live stream at home. We hope that you will stay engaged. We need everyone here to make our voices heard on this issue. In closing, I would like to share a statement from one of our DelcoCPR team members, Nelson Vecchione, who could not be here in person today. So this is Nelson's statement. Over the past several months, I have spent many hours collecting personal stories, transcribing notes, and listening to people recount their personal, often very difficult experiences at the George W.H. Correctional Facility. This process brought to mind several important realizations. First, that these former residents of GW Hill were all in need of help, and they were all deserving of dignified, humane treatment and rehabilitative services. Many of George W. Hill's former residents were there awaiting trial, unable to make bail, but not yet convicted or found guilty of any crimes or offenses. It's important to note that all these former residents at this facility are people first. Someone's mother, father, sister, brother, aunt, uncle, cousin, niece, nephew, employee, employer, or friend. They are in most ways just like you and me and many other members of our community. And for transparency's sake, I confess without pride that although I have never been to George W.H. facility, I have personal experience with the PA correctional facilities, where I did a lengthy stay, so I know when correctional policy works and when it doesn't. In my considered opinion, warehousing troubled human beings without offering them avenues to positively address and impact those issues, which led to the commission of their criminal acts, does a disservice to all and lends itself to increased rates of recidivism. Secondly, that many parents and family members who went to visit their children and loved ones did not need to be subjected to disrespectful interactions and increased anxiety because they were worried for their loved one's safety while at the GEO Group managed facility. Third, perhaps the saddest realization of all was that no person I spoke to, be they an ex-inmate, parent, or family member, told me that they had a positive experience at George W. Hill. No one even told me they had been helped in any way while they were there. The statement above is sad and unacceptable. The business of jails and prisons is corrections, and it is in these places of last-ditch efforts that we should avail troubled people with all we have at community's disposal. Remember, 97% of the people who go to jail or prison eventually return to their communities. Continuing to dump money into a facility that is not producing positive corrective experience for its residents does not ultimately benefit the community at large. It is my sincere hope that whatever happens today and in the near future regarding GEO Group's contract renewal, we all leave here today with renewed energy and commitment to improve these conditions in our correctional facilities for those who must live there, work there, and visit there. It's the end of Nelson's statement. Nelson's comments highlight the long-term work ahead of us to make this correctional facility truly humane. Deprivatizing this prison and returning it to public control is an important first step in ensuring more transparency and accountability and more humane treatment. As we have described, privately managed prisons are more prone to violence and increased recidivism, among other issues. No company should profit from the incarceration of human beings, and I hope you will join me in calling for an end to private prison management in Delaware County. So if you'll indulge us here, if we could all raise our voices and join us in repeating, people, not profits. We'll say this 3 times together. People, not profits. People, not profits. People, not profits. And one more call, just to underline the underlying message here. GEO must go. Must go. GEO must go. GEO must go. Thank you. Ending private management is an important first step, but is certainly not the only step. We need to work for continued improvements to this facility and to the entire criminal justice system in Delaware County as we fight to end mass incarceration. Deprivatizing Delco's prison is our first campaign issue, but it will not be the only one. In the future, we hope to work on issues, as Kabir mentioned, like cash bail reform, and we invite you to all of us to join us in this continued fight for prison reform in Delaware County. So the 3 steps you can take today, as a couple of people asked. First, you can join our mailing list so you can join in future actions. This is our second major public action since we came to be about a year ago. So you can find us at DelcoCPR. You can mark your calendars for Thursday, October 18th at 7:30 p.m. That's our next organizing meeting at Trinity Church in Swarthmore. I'm sorry? 7:30 p.m. Trinity Episcopal Church, thank you. That's right, there's nothing on my calendar. Trinity Episcopal Church in Swarthmore at 7:30 p.m. on October 18th, Thursday, October 18th. These meetings help us get to know each other better and help us, create the building blocks for all of these actions and future work that we're doing together. And third, you can call on your county council members and let them know that you were here today and the stories that you heard, and you want them to help deprivatize Delco's prison, which falls under their supervisory responsibility. Again, thank you all for coming and sharing your stories. Thank you to Councilman Zidek for your support and for being here today. Thank you to all the elected officials and candidates who've shown up in support on the issue. Thank you to the DelcoCPR team for putting this event together. We need to vacate the library in about 3 minutes. So we want to continue the conversation if people want to mingle and talk a little bit more in the library courtyard downstairs. Outside. Thank you. Outside. Thank you.